My sister's dog is like her son. My sister treats the dog like her own son. And after it had a baby, it was no different. She let the dog drink her milk. And treated it like her own nephew. With homemade meals. And secretly gloated that her two sons could get along. I kindly reminded her that some dogs may look docile, but are actually very aggressive. And good at acting. And not friendly with children. She retorted, "Our Lulu is very smart. And knows that this is his brother. So he won't bite him." The dog lover's mother also blamed me for meddling. And seeing as they were so stubborn, I had to give up. But then, an accident happened. My 2-year-old nephew and the dog fought over a toy. And nearly got bitten on the carotid artery. It was me who took the machete. And chopped the dog to death. Saving my nephew's life. But afterwards, my nephew said, the dog didn't bite him. It was just playing with him. My sister also hugged the dead dog. And looked at me with hatred. There was clearly another way. Why did you have to kill it? To avenge her dog's son. While I slept. She stabbed me to death. My mother covered for her. And issued a letter of understanding. In the end, my sister was acquitted. The following year, she gave birth to her second child. And lived a happy life. Only I carried hatred. My soul vanished into thin air. When I opened my eyes again, I returned to the day my sister held my nephew's hand and gave him a high five. I was awakened by my nephew's giggles. I turned my head. And saw him clutching a handful of dog hair in his hand. And laughing happily to himself. This scene was so familiar. I trembled and gave my thigh a hard pinch with my hand. The pain that quickly spread made me realize something that was almost impossible. I had been reborn. Reborn to the day before Duozi was killed. In my previous life. Before my sister got married. She adopted a dog from a friend. She treated the dog like her own child. She slept in the same bed with it. And ate from the same bowl as it. She took her dog's son everywhere with her. Before their nephew was born. They were quite the motherly daughter-in-law. The sister protected the dog. And the dog was very attached to her. Even my brother-in-law wanted to get close to her. He had to get her permission. My brother-in-law was dissatisfied. But because he was a member of the family, he had no say. Until he saw the dog and his 4-year-old nephew drinking breast milk together. My brother-in-law completely lost control. He scolded his sister. And said she should treat everyone equally. But that's not how you should treat everyone. My sister was justified. They were both my sons. How can breast milk not be shared? After a big fight, the two of them parted on bad terms. So my sister, in a fit of anger, took the dog and nephew and moved back to the countryside. She resented having too much stuff. And even took me along as free labor. While in the car, the naughty nephew unknowingly tugged on the dog's tail. I noticed the dog's erect fur. And occasional snarling. So I kindly reminded my sister that some dogs look docile. But are actually extremely aggressive. And good at acting. And not friendly with children. Not to mention the fact that she had raised a large dog. Known for its ferocity. An Argentinian dingo. But my kind reminder was not taken. My sister even snapped back. Our Lulu is smart. She knows that this is my brother. And won't bite him. After she finished, she stroked the dog's head. Right. Lulu. The dog whimpered twice. And wagged its tail. My sister looked at me. With a smug expression. Some people. If they are not liked. That's fine. And even the dog doesn't like her. Sarah. I can see that. You're just jealous of the close relationship between our Xiaoxua and Lulu. After arriving at our rural hometown, my sister told our mother about this like she was reporting a crime. Under the influence of my sister, my mother, who used to love eating dog meat, had also changed her ways. And became a dog lover. She immediately told me not to meddle in other people's business. And said that when children spend time with animals when they are young, they will become more caring. So I didn't dare to persuade her anymore. But not long after we moved to the countryside, something happened to my nephew. He was sitting on the ground playing with a toy, when the dog suddenly rushed over. and bit his toy hard with its mouth. My nephew didn't want to. The doggo opened its big mouth and unceremoniously bit my nephew. Fortunately, he was wearing more clothes in winter, so the dog didn't bite him. At that moment, when I saw this, I risked my life and quickly took my stunned nephew away, and then slashed the dog again to prevent a tragedy. Afterwards, my nephew passed out. When he woke up, his sister and mother asked him if the dog had bitten him. He kept shaking his head and said, "No, Happy loved playing with me," and later learned that I had killed the dog. My nephew burst into tears and called me a bad aunt, who even wanted me to die for the dog. I almost knelt down for him, but my nephew still spoke angrily. My mother said, "You're worthless. How can you compare to my brother?" My sister also hugged the dead dog and looked at me with hatred. She said, "Even if Lele was going to bite Xiaoxua, there were obviously other ways. Why did you have to kill it?" No matter how I explained, it was an emergency at the time. My sister and mother didn't believe me. That night, my angry sister stabbed me in my sleep to death with a knife. I'm so wronged. In my soul state, I watched my sister all the way, crying and finding my mother with her hands full of blood, saying she didn't mean to, and that she was just overwhelmed by anger. While my mother looked at me, tragically dead on the bed, with her eyes flickering for a long time. And finally, she made the house look like there had been a fight, and used my hand to hold the knife, deliberately slashing my sister several times, before calmly calling the police. This fatal accident was classified as excessive self-defense, and my mother tearfully issued a letter of understanding in court, and my sister was acquitted. Without the dog, my sister and her husband became even closer than before, and the following year, they had a second child. My mother felt no remorse, and only on the annual Qingming festival went to my grave and dripped 2 drops of cat urine on it. She said, "Your sister is now happy in her family, and our family line has been continued. Sarah, you can rest in peace." But how can I rest in peace? I hated them to death. Not long after, I carried my hatred. It vanished without a trace. But I never imagined that God would give me a chance to start over. At this moment, I quickly gathered my thoughts, suppressing the hatred churning inside me. Through the rearview mirror, I surveyed the family of 3, sitting in the back seat. My mischievous nephew, who was so disliked by everyone, still recklessly tugged on the dog's tail, while the dog appeared docile and let its young master pull it. But its impatience and ferocity were about to spill out of its eyes. If my sister wasn't sitting next to it, I'm afraid it would have pounced on the fragile toddler nearby. But my sister didn't notice at all. She was so caught up in the false atmosphere of brotherly harmony that she smiled and said, "Lulu, listen to your mother, and give your brother a high five." Okay. The sister was saying the same things as in her previous life. And the dog understood, reluctantly touched his nephew's hand, and quickly withdrew. The sister laughed even more happily. And I laughed too, and turned to look out the window. "Mary, this time, I'll see. Without my that thing urgent discretion of the knife. Can your son save his life from the dog's mouth?" From afar, some villager saw my sister, greeting warmly, "Mary is back." But when she saw the unruly dog standing next to her sister, the smile froze at the corner of her mouth. "Mary, why aren't you holding the leash again? Don't they say in the city now that you should walk your dog on a leash to please yourself and please others?" My sister just smiled and said, "Oh dear. You don't understand. Our Lulu is as smart as a 4 or 5-year-old. He's very obedient and doesn't bite, except that he's a bit big and looks intimidating. But inside he's a gentle little prince." The neighbors didn't say anything and kept quiet. My sister was already holding her nephew and calling the dog to keep walking. I even saw her give a subtle wink. Reading this, I sneered. "Gentle. That's only when you're around, Mary. If you pay attention to the surveillance cameras in her house, You'll find that Lulu is a two-faced person. But for the rest of my life, those things have nothing to do with me anymore. I'm happy to be at leisure. When I was almost home, while my sister was rummaging in her bag for the keys, Lulu ran away. I looked at the dog, running around like a runaway horse in the open field. After taking a look, my sister only shouted, "Lulu, don't run around." But the dog was disobedient by now. Its wild figure quickly attracted the attention of other dogs. So in just a few minutes, the village became noisy. The dogs barked one after the other, but none of them ran onto the road, except for my sister's dog, which had no leash around its neck and no muzzle in its mouth, running freely. Put away the luggage. My sister heard that the young and middle-aged men in the village were fishing in the pond, and she was used to joining in the fun. So she asked her nephew if he wanted to go with her to watch other people catch fish. My nephew squatted on the ground and watched the ants carrying food nonstop, without blinking. In a perfunctory tone, "Mom won't go." So my sister, just like in her previous life, looked at me and said matter-of-factly, "Sarah, keep an eye on little Shua for me. I'm going to watch them catch fish." After saying that, and without waiting for me to say yes, she had already put on her rain boots and rushed out of the house. When Lulu noticed the figure of his sister, he set off running, as if he wanted to go with her, but was stopped by his sister. "Lulu, your brother is still at home. Go and play with your brother." After saying that, she walked away without looking back, looking very relieved. When the dog came back, my nephew was already playing. I took out a toy from my bag, a small rubber ball, and he stood on the ground, patting the ball, with a giggle in his mouth, not noticing the dog behind him, whose eyes were fixed on the ball in his hands. I watched from the sidelines. The next moment, the dog moved and started chasing the ball, chasing my nephew, and soon ran to an open place with no cover. In my previous life, at this time I would have already rushed over and carried my nephew to the front door. So when the accident happened, I was able to rush home in time to grab a knife and kill the dog. But now, I'm sitting in my chair, smiling, watching the two brothers play happily, as if nothing had happened. Next door, Mrs. Zhang, the neighbor, saw this scene and disapproved. "Sarah, how can you let the children play with the dog? What if it bites or scratches them? Then it will be too late to regret. You are the children's aunt. You have to do something." After I calmed down, I smiled awkwardly at her. "Auntie Zhang, it's not that I don't want to. It's just that my sister has raised this dog like a son. To put it mildly, in her heart, my position may not even compare to that of this dog. In fact, I tried to persuade her before, but both my sister and my mother scolded me for ruining the brotherly bond between my nephew and the dog. As you can see, I don't have much say in this family. Now I dare not say anything. Besides, she often tells me that she regularly gives the dog medicine and vaccines, and that it is very safe, and that Lulu is also very good and doesn't bite." I looked over at the person and dog playing happily over there, and continued, "They've always been like this. You don't trust me. How could I not trust my sister?" The neighbor looked over to the person not far away, who was biting a ball in his mouth, and looked at his nephew proudly, before running happily towards the dog further away, and sighing. Without saying anything else, he picked up the fishing net in his hand, locked the door, and left. And the quiet returned. I sat on the bench, and occasionally glanced over at the man and dog. After about 10 minutes of playing, my nephew, who had never been able to catch the ball, looked at the dog and shrugged his shoulders. He seemed to think, if he cried, his toy would automatically come back to him. As usual, that's exactly what happened. But at this time, my sister wasn't there. So Lula stood there, with the ball in his mouth, shaking his head, as if he could see the smugness beneath his furry face. Seeing this, his nephew stopped crying and got up. Straight away. He grabbed the dog's tail. And yanked. So hard that a ball of dog hair came off. In the pain, Lele let out a scream. And the ball dropped to the ground. Whereupon his nephew rushed over. And held it in his arms. With a wicked grin. But the dog's temper had been completely aroused. And he opened his mouth. And bit at his nephew. But seemed to be holding back for some reason. He didn't bite directly at my nephew's exposed skin. But only threatened him through his clothes. While my nephew, who was crying loudly, and rolling on the ground to avoid the angry dog, had already become a muddy mess. I stood there motionless. As if I had been petrified. My nephew's howling soon attracted someone. I turned my head to look. Next door, Mrs. Zhang's son, Laurent, was running over with his bare hands. My heart tightened. This dog is in its rabid biting phase. And charging at him with its bare hands could easily lead to something bad. In my previous life, I chopped the dog with a knife. But it still bit my right arm. And my legs were covered in scratches. Lao Luan is a good person. Who often helps matchmaking for the neighbors. If I were to ask him to risk his life to save someone, I would not want to. Just as I was about to speak up to stop him, several elderly people came over. What's the matter? What are you all doing here? After taking a good look, they exclaimed in shock. Oh my God. Why is the dog biting people? Who owns this dog? It's not on a leash and it doesn't have a muzzle. It's clearly trying to harm people. Save the people. Hurry and save them. Someone seems to want to rush up to the dog. But when they see the clothes on the ground that have been torn to shreds by the dog, and when they see that when it stands up, it's the size of an adult man, the elderly people are scared again. At this moment, Thomas's cotton clothes have already been torn off. The dog is about to bite the sweater. Someone panics and picks up a brick and throws it. And missed. The dog turned its head towards us. With a fierce look on its face. Lauren wanted to rush over. But was held back by the old man on one side. If you go over there now. Do you want to get bitten to death too? You are our only child. Lauren couldn't break free. It wasn't until I looked closely that I realized that the old man holding him was the mother-in-law of the Zhangs next door. And also Lauren's maternal grandmother. Over there. The old man who had thrown the stone was shaking uncontrollably. But still picked up a brick. And was about to throw it a second time. At this critical moment, someone in the crowd suddenly said, the dog hasn't bitten the child yet. Has it? No matter what. You can't throw a brick at it. Look. The more you hit it, the more it'll go berserk. What if it bites you? Besides, the dog is probably a pet. It's very expensive. I say. Let's all disperse. Disperse. If the dog doesn't go berserk, it won't bite the child. Hearing this familiar voice, I raised my eyebrows. Hypocritical dog lover. My mother. Here she comes. What my mother said instantly provoked public anger. The old men and women usually walk unsteadily. But now they are arguing. With more energy than the young people. Pet dog. So what if it's a pet dog? If it bites someone, then it should be beaten to death. Nancy. Is this how you talk? So it's not your child who's been bitten. You don't feel sad. My mother froze for a second. And unceremoniously retorted. My child gets along very well with the dog. The dog would never bite him. She rattled on. But the crowd didn't want to hear. The old folks had already scattered. To look for something to save the boy with. Unfortunately, every family in the village had sent their young and strong to the waterfront to fish and watch the fun. Only the old, the sick and the weak were left in the village square basking in the sun and chatting. The gates were closed. And they couldn't even go home to get a farming tool to drive the dog away. Seeing his nephew crying in the middle of the field, with increasingly miserable cries, the only person on the scene who was capable of fighting the dog happily, Lauren, simply took off her cotton padded jacket and wrapped the exposed parts before planning to rush up. But my mother again grabbed his arm and stopped him. You go up and be careful. You'll get bitten too. My daughter said. This kind of dog is only nice to its owner. Do you want to die? Besides, you've been watching this for a long time. The child's parents and family haven't shown up. Not even close relatives were there. What are you playing at? And you won't get paid." As soon as she finished speaking, her nephew let out another wail. At that moment the dog, as if mad, began to bite his exposed skin. As a result of not being able to protect him in time, his face was already bleeding. The situation was extremely urgent. Lauren screwed up her eyebrows. "Auntie Chow. You can't put it that way. The child's clothes have been bitten so badly. If we don't beat the dog to death, the word, kill, was like stepping on my mother's last taboo." She immediately surrounded Lauren and dragged her away by the jacket with exposed skin. Sitting on the ground like a shrew, she wrapped her arms around his legs and said, "I don't care. As long as I'm here today, you're not allowed to kill the dog. No matter what." "Auntie Chow." Lauren's cold face was quite intimidating. My mother was instantly intimidated. But she still wouldn't let up. "This kid's mother is not here. Even if something really happened today, it's got nothing to do with you. In my opinion, even if you killed the dog today and saved the child, he will continue to be in debt. And the next time he will be bitten to death by another dog." This remark was really vicious. I also frowned and carefully examined my mother's expression, and saw that while she was physically stopping Lauren, her eyes kept looking at the dog in the middle of the field that was biting her nephew's clothes. In just a moment, I had an epiphany. She recognized that this dog was Lulu, but her sister was not around. So she probably didn't recognize the muddy and bloodied child on the ground as her own dear grandson. Lauren was being dragged by my mother, with his entire neck and cheeks exposed, and his legs held by my mother's rascal, making it almost impossible for him to walk. But fortunately, men are strong, and with a little skill, he was able to pull his legs free, and rushed home as fast as he could, seemingly to get the farming tools. And my mother's rascal-like behavior had angered the neighbors. Grandma Lauren, leaning on her crutches and spitting out her anger, said, "Lauren is the only child in our Oldley family. I agree that he should go save people. What else do you have to say?" The others also joined in the anger. "Nancy, do you have a heart? If we delay any longer, the child will be bitten to death by the dog. Is the dog's life more important? Or the child's life? Your family's Mary also has a child. If the person being bitten now were your grandson, Xiaoshua, would you also hope that everyone would just stand by and do nothing?" Hearing this, my mother, like a firecracker that has been lit, rushed over directly and grabbed the old woman shouting at her by the hair and said, "You're full of shit. How dare you curse my daughter and grandson? I'll fix you." When she was young, she was already famous in the village as a shrew, with a lot of strength in her hands. And with this push, she actually didn't do any harm. She pushed the old woman backwards, and she fell directly to the ground, wailing in pain. Someone panicked and shouted, "Lauren, come back. Your grandmother has been pushed over by that nasty woman Nancy. You'd better get someone to take the old lady to the hospital. A broken bone in an elderly person is no small matter. Many people have lost their lives just from a fall." Lauren had already run halfway there. But seeing this, she had to turn back. After giving my mother a cold look, she crouched down and picked up her grandmother, who was wailing on the ground, and ran towards the village clinic. Lauren left. The rescue continued. Over there, Thomas's sweater and fleece pants had been bitten all over. Someone looked at the burning scene and was afraid to go forward, but also wanted to save the child. In the end, someone proposed calling the fire department to ask them to help catch the dog. At the same time, they called to ask them to help save the child, just in case. In the end, this proposal was agreed by everyone. Even my mother was huddled in the corner and didn't say a word. I glanced at my mother and inadvertently asked a question. "Everyone. Grandparents. 10. It's true that you can call. But there's a fee. Who's going to pay for it? The child has been bitten like this. and is now being taken to the hospital for treatment, which will definitely cost a lot of money. And that money will also have to be paid in advance. Everyone here is unemployed, and an old, sick woman and child who will toil for the rest of their lives. For a moment, everyone was silent. I know my mother. She is a pushover. And she will definitely not be the one to pay. Sure enough. Amidst the silence, she was the first to object. Well, you all shout. I won't pay a penny anyway. After being glared at fiercely, she said defiantly. You think I got money to spare? If you want to be good, go ahead. I, Nancy, have been a wicked woman all my life. I don't mind being one more time. The child died. That was his bad luck. His parents were careless. It's got nothing to do with me. By now, no one was paying any attention to her. Everyone gathered together to discuss the matter. In the end, the only person who had brought along an old-fashioned mobile phone was a grandfather, who dialed and spoke haltingly. Everyone chimed in to explain the situation. As soon as the phone call ended, the fishermen returned. One after the other. Mrs. Zhang was covered in mud. When she saw my mother, she looked surprised. Nancy, what are you doing here? Your Mary's been looking all over for you. My mother was taken aback. My Mary? Where is she? Mrs. Zhang pointed behind her and said everyone's fishing. She's brought your little grandson and the dog. They've already unloaded the luggage. You didn't see me sunbathing in the square. You didn't see Shua. As soon as she finished speaking, as if she had thought of something, she suddenly turned her head and looked at the dog in the middle of the field that let out a roar from time to time from its throat. And her nephew lying on the ground. For a second. 2 seconds. Her hand visibly shook. I watched her shove her hand into her pocket. Among the reproaches of the neighbors. You have a phone earlier when we called you couldn't take it out. She dialed her sister's number. But there was no answer. The phone dropped with a pop to the ground. I picked it up and saw on the status bar notification. A short while ago. A push notification from Douyin had arrived. It was a special attention from my mother. My sister had posted a Douyin on the ride. I clicked in to see. The location was in the village. The accompanying photo was a picture of her nephew, the dog, and herself. I handed the phone to my mother. Mom, look. She saw the photo and the text, bringing home the 2 sons. On top, my mother suddenly let out a scream. Then her knees gave way, and she actually knelt directly on the ground. She looked at the child, who was lying in the middle of the field. From time to time, he cried. The next moment, suddenly felt full of strength, and, like a madman, got up from the ground. Xiaoshua, my dear grandson. Her voice was full of grief. You damn dog. How could you bite my grandson like this? Then she looked around at the people, crying. Go save him. You have to save my grandson. But no one answered. The dog's huge size was enough to intimidate an adult. The low growl made people who didn't have any handy tools dare not go forward. Seeing this, the mother, controlled by her emotions of worry and anger, threw the mobile phone she was holding directly at it. This throw directly angered the dog. Lula rushed towards the big guy like crazy. All the villagers who had returned from fishing stayed frozen for a second, and then instantly reacted. No one wanted to be bitten. But for the time being, they could only use the fishing nets and other tools in their hands to close together, forming a huge encirclement, hoping to trap the dog and prevent it from harming anyone else. Looking at the pile of torn clothes on the ground, and then at the thin fishing net, no one dared to take it lightly. For a moment, the entire village could only hear the dog's mad barking. My mother was about to throw something else, but was held back by a pair of hands from behind. Auntie Chow, knew you were anxious. But that dog really couldn't be provoked now. I recognized this person. He was a college student from the family at the east end of the village who had returned for the winter holidays. He was also one of the few young people in this group But before he could finish speaking, my mother slapped him on the back of his hand. And he was left dazed. Then you go save him. You go save him. Seeing that no one was moving, my mother pushed the young man in front of her to the ground, kindly blocking, and getting slapped in the face. The young man finally reacted. He let go of my mother's hand that was blocking him, and angrily said, "Since you are so strong, then you go save yourself." Furious to the extreme, he reversed the operation, and pushed my mother hard with his hand behind her back. My mother was pushed to stumble, and enter the dog's line of sight. The happy barking sound, and glaring eyes, seemed to treat the woman in front of her who had entered the encirclement as the next person to tear apart. My mother trembled and whispered, "Lele. To am your grandmother. Don't you recognize me?" The dog didn't respond. From deep in its throat came a lower growl, paired with its huge body. It was intimidating to make eye contact. As if scared by the dog's bark, she shrank back a little, and quickly darted back. Noise so fierce. I can't get bitten. Seeing her like this, I recalled in my past life. After the accident, she and her sister stood united, and shouted at me. I laughed. Sure enough, it happened again. Selfish people are still so selfish. My mother didn't dare go up herself, but still wanted to save her grandson. She didn't give up. Her gaze kept searching the crowd, trying to find a brave person to help her rescue her nephew. But everyone looked at the dog in the center. No one dared to move. I don't know if it was because it was seriously injured, or because it was so scared it passed out. My nephew was lying on the ground, unconscious. No one else moved. If no one else intervened, my nephew would most likely bleed to death. Just then, Lauren returned. In her hands, she held shiny implements, a knife, and a stick. The dog was facing us. It was about a meter away from my nephew. I watched as she turned lightly to the dog's back, held her weapon, crossed the fishing net, and entered the encirclement. Slowly, she protected my nephew behind her. As long as the dog didn't notice, as long as it bent down, pick up my nephew. And if he did what I did in my previous life, and finished the dog off with one stroke of the knife, the war would be over. But I would not be satisfied. At that moment, my mind kept replaying what happened in my previous life. I remembered my arm that was almost bitten off, and my leg that was scratched. I remembered my nephew, under the series of hints from my sister's eyes, saying that the dog did not bite him, calling me a bad aunt, and telling me to pay for the dog's life. I remember crying and begging my mother to take me to get a rabies vaccine. But she just said, "Serves you right," and dismissed it. I remember in my sleep being stabbed in the back by my blood-related sister, and dying a miserable death. My eyes turned red. These people, why should they be saved? They deserve to die. So I crouched down, and picked up a small stone from the ground, and smashed it precisely at the dog's head. The dog was in pain, and spun around violently. Only then did I notice that there was someone standing behind me, and the low growling started again. Lauren's hand froze, and her attempt to rescue the person had to be put on hold. She stood guard, holding the stick in her hand, and the knife in her right hand, her eyes fixed coldly on the dog. The man and the dog were locked in a standoff. At that moment, along with the sound of footsteps, came a scream from the crowd. "Don't hurt it, Lauren. That's my happy. You heard it. I want you to pay with your life." Sister Mary pointed at Lauren, shouted hoarsely. The crowd looked at her in disbelief. "Mary, are you crazy? The dog has bitten your son like that, and you're still defending it. Is the dog's son more important? Or is your own son more important?" Hearing this, my sister angrily said, "No way. Lulu could never bite Xiao Shua. The two brothers were so close. Lulu was so well behaved, and could never bite anyone." Seeing my sister being so stubborn, I didn't bother to persuade her. They pulled the fishing net apart of their own accord to make an exit. Then you can see for yourself. If the dog with blood all over its mouth is your son, look at the dying child lying on the ground. And see if it is your own son. 2 seconds later. Everyone heard her voice scream in anguish. Lele. Why did you bite Xiaoxua like that? She tried to go over to him. But the dog, for some reason, as if it didn't recognize Mary, barked at her in a low growl. Lele. I'm your mother. Don't hurt your brother. Okay. Xiaoxua is your brother. Lele. The dog stood there, still emitting a terrifying growl from its throat. My sister froze in place, too afraid to move. The normally docile and obedient dog had suddenly become fierce and bit. She suddenly lost her usual composure. What should I do? It was as if her worldview had collapsed. She was at a loss for words and kept repeating, looking at the blood on the ground. 2 tears slowly flowed from her eyes. My child, my nephew, lying on the ground, suddenly woke up, in pain, and moaned nonstop. But his voice was already very weak. My sister's eyes suddenly turned red. When she saw me in the crowd, she suddenly came up like crazy. Sarah, I told you to watch Xiaoxua. What the hell were you watching? How could you let Lulu bite him like that? Go save him for me. Go. She was very strong. I was pushed and stumbled, and was instantly pushed into a circle of people. The dog, which had calmed down, suddenly looked over. At that moment, I felt as if I had returned to my previous life, and was fighting a desperate battle with the dog. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. When Lila charged at me with a hiss, the villagers behind me quickly picked up my nephew, who was lying on the ground. I stood there stiffly, with my ears still able to hear my mother's screams. Sarah, Xiaoxua is the only blood in our family. He has to survive. You stand there and let the dog bite you. You're Shua's aunt. That's what you should do. Anger welled up in my heart, but my body wouldn't move. Am I going to die again? Start over? Can't I change my fate? No. Why? I want to live. In that split second, looking at the dog charging at me, my instinct to survive gave me a burst of terrifying strength. I acted quickly. I shouted to Lauren, who was standing nearby. Throw me the stick. Quickly raised his hand over there. I caught the stick in midair and swung it at the dog that was running at me like crazy. I heard only a series of urgent cries of pain, and the dog ran away. I stood there panting loudly when Lauren rushed over and took the stick from me, putting me behind his back. Stay away. When I turned my head, his expression became very serious, because the dog in pain was howling all around. The people outside the encirclement were clenching their fishing nets in fear. Then I saw Laurent pull something out of his pocket and throw it quickly in front of the snarling dog, and yell, "Everyone, keep quiet for now. And don't make any sudden movements. Just wait." It was a bone. After a while of snarling, the dog came forward to sniff it. Slowly, it calmed down. Everyone let out a long sigh of relief. However, at that moment, I felt a heavy object hit my back. I saw a small, round-headed household machete smash into my back and fall to the ground with a thud. I looked in the direction of the sound and saw my mother standing in the crowd, shouting angrily at Sarah. I almost got bitten by a dog. My mother said, "You had to stand there and do nothing." I had to stand there and let myself get bitten. For nothing. I had to risk my life. And I got a sneer in return. I bent down and picked up the machete and planned to throw it at her location. But it was too late. Because Zhang Dajiang, who had always been smiling at everyone, was now full of murderous intent, and slapped my mother's cheek, as if she had used her full strength. "Fuck you, Nancy. You bitch. You almost cut off my son's toe." In an instant, my mother's mouth suddenly dripped a trace of bright red blood. And just now, after the knife hit the ground and smashed to Lauren's toe, was only a centimeter away. "Mrs. Zhang is a strong mother." I heard my mother cry out in pain. But her hand did not stop for a second. "If it weren't for your daughter's stupid behavior today, leaving the dog unattended, how could this have happened? Blame Sarah. How can you face If it weren't for your family's Mary treating the dog like a son, and if you had not repeatedly ignored Sarah's advice, how could the dog have been raised to be neither human nor dog? My mother froze. And after she reacted, she sat down on the ground with a thud and let out a cry of pain, crying out for help. But everyone just stood there, motionless. Someone said, "Nancy, you're not a human being. Sarah is your own flesh and blood. How could you push her into the fire?" The place fell silent. Everyone glared at my mother. Just then, the sound of sirens could be heard from the village entrance. And almost simultaneously, with the help of special equipment, the firefighters quickly into a cage. After the paramedics had given my nephew a basic examination, they immediately and solemnly carried him back to the hospital. As the stretcher passed by me, I could only see my nephew for the rest of my life. Although he had not been bitten in the carotid artery, there were deep and shallow bite marks on his face and exposed arms. Some of the wounds had already stopped bleeding, while others were still oozing blood. Even his chest barely rose and fell. Looking at the serious faces of the medical staff, I knew my nephew would probably not get through this easily. My mother and sister still hadn't reacted at this point. They looked at the scattered blood spots on the ground and associated them with what had happened to my nephew. They hugged each other and cried out in pain. One wailed, "My son." One wailed, "My grandson." The villagers watching, most of the families there had children. When they saw this, their eyes also reddened. Zhang Dajiang, who had been scolding my mother so eloquently, after a moment's hesitation, couldn't help but go up to her to comfort her. "Don't worry. There are doctors here. Shua will be fine." But this sentence seemed to open up a gap. My mother waved away the hand that Zhang Dajia had placed on her shoulder with a slap. "It's fine. Zhang Hohot. You make it sound so easy. It's not your child who got bitten. Of course you can stand here and look down on others and point at other villagers who also had red eyes with malice. If it weren't for your poor treatment today, how could my grandson have been bitten like that? It's all your fault. I curse your grandson. In the future, when he goes out, may he be bitten by a dog, or run over by a car, or killed by a falling object, or choked on his own vomit." These words truly angered everyone. In everyone's eyes, any sympathy they might have felt for my mother vanished in an instant. I could even read their thoughts. "Hopeless. Serves you right." Even my sister, with wide eyes, looked at my mother in shock. "Mom, what are you talking about?" It wasn't until the paramedics shouted from the ambulance, "Are the family members getting in or not?" They were like waking from a dream. "You just wait and see. My grandson was bitten. You all can't escape responsibility. You'll all pay for his medical expenses." The villagers all looked disgusted. It seemed to be the first time they had seen my mother's worst side. My sister sat in the ambulance and cried, cursing, "Mom, what are you doing? Hurry up and find someone to go with the ambulance to the hospital." My nephew was ultimately unable to be saved. Lauren kindly drove my mother and me to the city hospital. I could only hear Mary's cries of despair outside the resuscitation room. But she had no face to cry. My brother-in-law, who I hadn't seen for a long time, picked her up from the ground and slapped her hard. Then he angrily rebuked, "How many times have I told you? That animal you keep has a problematic personality. I told you to get rid of it. But you wouldn't listen. Are you satisfied now? You compensate me for my son." When my mother saw her sister being beaten, she immediately rushed up and punched her brother-in-law in the arm. "What are you doing hitting my daughter? Can't you see she's crying? You're a useless son-in-law in our family. Why are you showing off in front of my daughter? Let's be honest. You're just a dog. My daughter is the master." Hearing this, brother-in-law gave them a menacing look. "Yes. I'm a dog. Mary. At the beginning, because I liked you. I accepted your family's request for me to marry into your family. And your request for me to continue keeping the dog. But now, we're finished. That animal. I won't let you see it again. When my sister reacted, she hurried over to chase after it. She, who had always been so arrogant, kept on kneeling on the ground and unceasingly promised that she was wrong, and that she would do whatever Locke wanted, and that she would bear him children, and that she would not ask him to join her family, and that the children would bear his surname. Please don't be angry. And please don't abandon me. My sister had always been spoiled by her husband. But now, when she learned that this husband, who was willing to tolerate all her flaws, was going to leave her completely, she finally panicked. But it was already too late. As she watched her husband's receding back, with a loud bang, amid my mother's shocked cry, she fainted. My mother was flustered, calling for a doctor, and then following him to the resuscitation room. While I opened my phone, the message bar was hanging at the top. Was a message I had sent to my brother-in-law not long ago. My brother-in-law Xiaoshua was bitten by Lele earlier and is now receiving emergency treatment at the city hospital. Come quickly. Delete the message. I raised the corner of my mouth. Sister. In this life, you will never have a second child. After my sister woke up, went crazy, the toys that her nephew had brought back to the old home instead became the few relics he left behind. She began to hug the toys all day, talking to herself. Xiaoshua, be good. When Dad finishes work, he will come to Grandma's house to pick us up. But her nephew's death took away her brother-in-law's last shred of patience, and the last bit of love he had for his sister. He was determined to get a divorce and would rather leave with nothing. I don't know if her madness was real or not. I only know that after months of entanglement, the night she got her divorce certificate, she sat on the bay window for hours, holding a photo of her nephew and the dog. My mother was worried, and kept watch over her for a few hours. But at 5 a.m., my mother dozed off and woke up. There was no one in the house. Not long after, a shout from the sanitation worker woke up everyone in the community. My sister was dead. She jumped from the building with her nephew's toy in her arms. My mother organized her funeral. It lasted 3 days. I was like a machine, watching the guests come and go, without crying, without even a spare expression on my face. After she was cremated, I held the urn, and finally felt a sense of peace. I can say, I have avenged myself for my own senseless death in my previous life. After my sister's funeral, I started packing. When my mother saw this, she panicked and took the things from me. Sarah, where are you going? Don't you want your mother anymore? I smiled, and calmly took back the towel from her. Well, I don't want you anymore either. But, Mom, remember, you were the one who didn't want me. In the future, I won't be coming back. But don't worry, I'll pay you the minimum support as living expenses. As for the family line, there's nothing outstanding about our genes anyway. It'll end with you. After I said that, I turned around and left. From now on, Sarah, will be all alone. But the sky is the limit for me. And I can fly as high as I like. It can't get any worse than in my previous life.